You're seeing chapter 294, where we literally see Isagi shape-shifting into Kaiser, representing the fact that Isagi has fully adapted the skill of Kaiser's off-ball movements. I realized something, and no, it's not that Isagi was able to score this goal because of plot. It's actually the opposite. Blue Lock has repeatedly introduced characters with very similar playstyles or characteristics to Isagi. Initially, I just glossed over this fact until I realized that each one of these Isagi clones explain why and how Isagi was able to become the #1 player in Blue Lock. So in this video, I'm going to go over every Isagi clone character and explain why and how each of them are similar to Isagi and how they all explain Isagi's success through a singular trait, showing how it was not plot that got Isagi to where he is. But before we dive in, let me quickly define what I mean by Isagi clone. I obviously don't mean a literal clone of Isagi, as this is a sports anime we're talking about. When I say an Isagi clone, I'm referring to a player who shares a key trait with Isagi, which each one of them having at least one, whether it's a similar playstyle to Isagi or similar mentality. Each one of these players in a way represents a different version of Isagi if he lacked one of his other key traits. For example, the first player I'm going to be talking about is Naruhaya from the second selection. I call him an Isagi clone because he has very similar skills to Isagi, but he was unable to fully adapt like the actual Isagi, so he got eliminated. This is highlighting Isagi's adaptability trait, which is something that Naruhaya lacked. So by analyzing these players, we can see in detail what makes Isagi special enough to become the #1 player in the NEO. So as I mentioned before, the first player I'm talking about is Naruhaya, who I have as the unadaptable version of Isagi. Naruhaya is probably one of the most similar characters to Isagi because, like Isagi, Naruhaya doesn't have a genius weapon, which I'm going to be covering later in the video with another character. But generally what I mean is that both these guys in the second selection were seen as irrelevant side characters during the 2v2 between Isagi and Nagi versus Baro and Naruhaya. The only difference is that in this match, both Isagi and Naruhaya tried to adapt during this game by using the other person's weapons. Naruhaya failed while Isagi succeeded in this. Naruhaya was unable to fully achieve Isagi's direct shot weapon, while Isagi was able to achieve Naruhaya's off-ball movement weapon. So because of this, Naruhaya represents Isagi if he was unable to adapt to new situations and pick up new skills. As if Isagi had unsuccessfully adapted Naruhaya's weapon, he would likely be in the same situation as Naruhaya, which is eliminated from Blue Lock. The next player that needs to be talked about is Nico, who I have as the egoless version of Isagi. And this is not to say that Nico does not have an ego, as he clearly does, as we've been shown that multiple times, and he obviously wouldn't make it this far in Blue Lock if he didn't have an ego. So what I mean by egoless is simply that Nico doesn't have the same amount of ego and selfishness as Isagi. When you look at both Nico and Isagi, you can see that they're essentially the same player. Nico's height is about 5'8", and Isagi's height is about 5'9", putting them at essentially the same height. Both of them are also not physical players, as most of the other Blue Lock characters are stronger and faster than them. Lastly, they're both smart players who use metavision to analyze the game. The only key difference between Isagi and Nico is Isagi is willing to do whatever it takes to prove himself as a striker, while Nico is more accepting of reality and shifts over to a more defensive role. Realistically speaking, both of these players are not naturally built to be strikers, but Isagi, unlike Nico, is not willing to accept that and continues to push forward. We even see this in the manga with Isagi originally getting an offer from Bastard Munchen where they want him to be playing as a cam, but he refuses, saying that he wants to continue working towards being the best striker, not a cam. Back to Nico though, Nico essentially represents a version of Isagi that is willing to accept the circumstances and change to the position better naturally suited for him, which if Isagi had done this, he obviously wouldn't be able to become a top player in the NEO, as he wouldn't be a striker anymore. The next person I've listed as an Isagi clone is Shido. Now, a lot of you are probably confused as to how I think Isagi and Shido are similar at all, but hear me out first. I have Shido as a direct shot genius version of Isagi. And what I mean by that is simply based off the concept of talented learners and geniuses that we are told about in chapter 281, where it essentially says that geniuses are logical outliers with unique skills that regular people can't understand. And talented learners are people who are able to recognize geniuses and play around that fact in a logical fashion by adapting. With that said, when we take a look at Shido's playstyle, it is rather simple, but it's based around instinctively hunting for open spaces to receive a pass and score a goal from that spot. The logical part of this is how Shido simply plays off instincts when it comes to his positioning, because he doesn't need the perfect spot to shoot the ball. Shido's acrobatic ability essentially allows him to score goals no matter how the ball gets to him or his position. This allows him to place himself in a logical position for the pass. On the other hand, Isagi, who is the talented learner of this playstyle, must calculate the most optimal position to be in. To simplify this down even more, Shido doesn't need a lot of space to get his shots off on net, giving him more options to position himself. Because of this, he can go to whichever position feels the most correct for him to receive the pass, not necessarily the actual best position for him to be in. Isagi, on the other hand, needs a little bit more space to get his shots off, so therefore he's required to go to the optimal spot to receive the pass. The other similarity between these two characters, more obvious, as it's what they do when they receive the ball. Because both players get into their preferred shooting angle before receiving the ball, all they are required to do once they get the ball is simply shoot. This is why all of the goals both Shido and Isagi score typically come from a direct shot, with Shido simply having the more illogical version of Isagi's direct shot. Shido shows how the concept of Isagi's method of scoring goals is valid, as it is the standard method for the poacher variant of a striker to score. The problem with Shido though, and why he falls short of becoming a top striker in the Neo Egoist League, despite being a more naturally gifted scoring machine than Isagi, is because he's stuck in a one-dimensional thought process. As if we see in the most recent PXG match, Shido was basically shut down as soon as he was man-marked by Kunigami. This happens because Shido, being a genius, is unable to logically think of a solution to this problem. Isagi, on the other hand, being the talented learner version, would be able to think of a solution if he were to be man-marked, as we've seen many times whenever Ness or Kaiser tries to interfere with his shots. The next player that I'll be going over is Otia, who I have as the movement genius version of Isagi. Otia and Isagi are similar, as they both rely on off-ball movements to slip past defenders to score goals. The key difference is that Otia is faster than Isagi, and he is also a natural genius when it comes to this skill. The problem with Otia, and why he hasn't done extremely well in the Neo Egoist League, is because like Shido, he fails to pick up any new skills or significantly improve throughout the series. Because of this, Otia represents Isagi if he were to simply only focus on his off-ball movement skill and nothing else. Otia is still likely to be in the top 23 players at the end of the NEL, but I doubt he will be very high on that list. This shows that in order for Isagi to succeed, he would need to improve in a multitude of things, as having one singular super strong weapon is not enough to make it to the top, which is why we'll probably see Otia low on the top 23 list. The next player I have is Nagi, who is the desireless version of Isagi. While Nagi is more naturally gifted than Isagi due to his trapping skill, these two are still quite similar in terms of weapons. We are even told this earlier on in the second selection, where Nagi and Isagi are preparing to go against Baro and Naruhaya. It's here Isagi realizes that both of them must receive a good pass in order to enable their weapons, as their weapons can only be used after receiving a pass. Although this eventually changes as both Nagi and Isagi find workarounds for this, it still shows how Nagi and Isagi at their core have similar weapons. So if that's the case, why is Nagi failing in the Neo Egoist League while Isagi isn't? It's simply because Nagi lacks the desire to become number one as a striker, unlike Isagi. Because of Nagi's personality, he lacks the ability to set large goals for himself they can continuously work towards, while Isagi is constantly looking for ways to become the best in the world. Nagi simply looks for the easiest way to achieve smaller goals, while Isagi works harder to achieve bigger goals constantly. This is why Nagi represents the version of Isagi if he lacked a strong desire to be the best. Next person I got listed is not a natural player, as it's Ego, who I have as the original Isagi. As Noah himself stated in chapter 204, Isagi has this exact same mindset and football philosophy as Ego. Now, in this case, it might be more fitting to say Isagi is actually the clone of Ego, as the whole Blue Lock project is essentially Ego just pushing his football philosophy into the minds of a bunch of players, with Isagi being the one that matches it the best. While we still don't know much about Ego, we do know that he used to play and he was actually good enough to be considered rivals with Noah at some point. Based on the way Noah compared Isagi to Ego, along with how Ego always has these monologues when it comes to talking about Isagi, I think it would be at least safe to assume that these two had similar playstyles. On top of that, just based on how Ego looks, he's quite skinny, so it would be safe to assume that Ego was probably not a physical player similar to Isagi, further proof that their playstyles were likely to be similar. Ego represents the fact that the mindset and football philosophy Isagi has picked up from him does in fact work, because if it didn't, Ego would not have been good enough of a player for Noah to consider him a rival. So why Ego himself didn't surpass Noah, we obviously don't know, but we do know that the blueprint Ego has built out for Isagi can and does work, as it has already helped Isagi become tied for number 1 in the NEL. The next player is Kaiser, who I've listed as the best version of Isagi. Kaiser is the most obvious Isagi clone, as their playstyles are exactly the same, with the only one difference between them being their weapons. Aside from Kaiser having better physical stats than Isagi, Kaiser is simply put just an Isagi with a better weapon. And the weapon I'm referring to is the Kaiser Impact over the Isagi direct shot. When you dumb down the explanation of the Kaiser Impact, it is essentially just a faster and more powerful version of Isagi's direct shot. Throughout the NEL, as far as I remember, Kaiser never does a Kaiser Impact off a dribble and always uses it as a direct shot similar to Isagi's shooting technique. The difference between the two is that the Kaiser Impact can be consistently used from farther out and on tougher angles due to its quick shooting speed, while Isagi's direct shot needs to be much closer to the net. Moving away from the differences, these two weapons are extremely similar, as they are both very adaptable. They have different versions based on the original move, with the Kaiser Impact having the Kaiser Impact Magnus and Isagi's direct shot having its 2-gun volley form. Moving away from the weapons, when going through the manga, it's honestly pretty clear that Isagi and Kaiser are essentially the same kind of player, as the first time we see Kaiser play, Isagi immediately says that Kaiser is the embodiment of his ideal movements on the pitch. And also, in more recent chapters, you get the even more obvious comparison where we have the awakened Ness giving a fast-paced pass to the optimal position for a striker where he expected Kaiser to be, only for it to end up being Isagi. Kaiser represents the fact that Isagi's playstyle is valid and it is a good pathway to becoming an elite striker. Out of all the attackers in the NEL, excluding the Masters, Kaiser has the most value. This shows that the playstyle Isagi is adapting is in fact a valid approach to becoming the best player in the NEL. Kaiser has essentially already done that, except he doesn't count because he's not a Blue Lock player. Next player I have is Rin, who I have as the genius version of Isagi. Or specifically, Rin is the genius version of Isagi's adaptability skill. Now, to be honest, especially after the PXG vs Bass Munchen game, I don't see much of a valid argument for Isagi to be put as the plot armor character when you have a character like Rin in the series. Rin is essentially just the genius version of Isagi, meaning that Rin can do everything Isagi can do and better without logic. Because geniuses are illogical and Rin is good at adapting, Rin basically just becomes an unstoppable character without reason. And what I mean by that is Rin could be on the verge of losing a match and then he could just pop out with something insane and it would just be explained as he's a genius, so he simply just evolved to achieve this insane feat. But for characters like Isagi, who is not a genius, in order for him to have an insane feat, it must be explainable. This is the main reason as for why I don't see an argument for plot Isagi. Because every time Isagi manages to win in a situation, there's always a logical reason behind it. For example, after the conclusion of the Bass Munchen vs Paris X Gen match, first thing we see Isagi do is explain how he was able to score in a logical manner, as you see this through a conversation with Kaiser and Isagi. But unlike Isagi, during the match, whenever Rin does something, there's a lack of explanation or a logical reason as to why he was able to achieve what he did. An example of this is when Kaiser does a new technique, which is the Kaiser Impact Cross Magnum, and it catches everyone on the field off guard, including characters like Karazu, who is a talented learner with Metavision, just for it to be stopped by Rin, who randomly unlocks Predator Eye and at the same time uses it defensively, which we have never seen before. And the explanation we get for this play is simply the genius is mutating. Personally, I don't have much of a problem with this, but it just goes to show that if there was to be a plot armor character in the show, it would be Rin and not Isagi. But to be fair, Rin's character would need to be this way in order to keep up with Isagi's constant adapting. At the end of the NEL, Rin and Isagi both share the same value above all the other players in the NEL, because they are essentially the same player, as they are both very good at adapting, which in the NEL happens to be the strongest weapon for someone to have. The only difference between their adapting capabilities, one is an illogical genius when it comes to adapting, while the other is the logical, talented learner when it comes to adapting. So after going through all these players, similar to Isagi, is Isagi just a product of plot convenience? I don't think so, because each of these players showed how Isagi was able to logically achieve every key trait that he needed to surpass everyone else in the NEL, making him deserving of his top spot alongside Rin.